Our kids have been pestering us to get a pet for forever. You see, many years ago, in a particularly frustrating parenting moment, my wife made a promise that they'd not let us soon forget. We were dealing with a resistant potty training child, and in a moment of sheer desperation, my wife cried out, "I will get you a pet as soon as no one in this home wears diapers." Thinking, of course, in that moment that day would never come. It felt like it would never come, yet it did come. And our children have not let us forget that deal to this day. But for a whole host of reasons, we're not ready to commit to a pet full time. But I thought, is there a way to at least give them a little bit of a taste of what it would be like to have a pet? And so I started to look into fostering a pet. And I thought we could probably pull this off. And so I did the research, I filled out the paperwork, I got approved. I don't know, like do background searches or whatnot, or Google searches on you and think, you'll be okay for this. And we got approved, but I didn't tell our kids. I didn't want to get their hopes up. Well, eventually we got placed with a little cat named Marcia. And so in preparation for hosting Marcia, I told our kids that we would be having company. I didn't mention that Marcia was a cat. I just said we would be hosting Marcia. And they asked about her, and I said, "I really don't know her." They're like, "What do you mean you don't know her?" I was like, "Well, I've seen pictures of her, and I heard a little bit about her, and I know she's had a bit of a rough go the past couple of years, but we're going to host her." And the kids were really thrown off. We talk a lot about hospitality in our home. We take it as a call from Jesus to host people and practice hospitality. And our kids participate in that with us. So they're used to it. But in this case, they're like, there's some details lacking in this situation. And so they said, well, how long is she going to stay for? And we said, I don't know. Maybe a couple days, a couple weeks. Maybe a couple months. And they're like, what? What are you talking about? And this is right before Thanksgiving, and they knew we had company, and all the beds in our home were going to be taken up, and they said, "Where's Marcia going to sleep?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't think of that." I said, "Well, do you think she could sleep in your bed? Or could she sleep at the foot of your bed?" And they're like freaking out right now. They're like, "What is wrong with our dad?" They're like, "No, she can't stay there." I was like, "Well, maybe she'll sleep on the couch or maybe even on the floor. I don't know." And I knew Marcia had been through some things, and so I was trying to prepare them. I said, "Hey, listen, guys, Marcia's had a rough go the past couple of years, and we really want to do a good job of welcoming her, of hosting her, of loving on her. And do you think you can do that?" And they're like, "Yeah, we can do that. We can do that." I was like, "Cool." I said, "You know what would probably make her feel really good is if after a couple days or so, you guys would snuggle with her." And my sons looked at me like something was incredibly wrong with me. And they're like, "Do what?" And I was like, "Yeah, just maybe try to comfort her." And they're like, "No, we're not doing that. That's weird. You tell us not to do that with random people, and now you're telling us to do it." And I was like, "Yeah, but I bet you will." And one of my sons was like, "There's no way I will ever do it." I said, "I bet you $5 within a week you'll be snuggling Marcia." He says, "I'll take that bet." So last Sunday, they're driving home from kids choir here at church, and I have Marcia at home, and they are peppering my wife with questions. I mean, they're freaking out. This might have gone too far because they were stressed. They didn't know what was happening, what was wrong with their dad, what their dad had signed them up for. And they walked in the door, and they saw that Marcia was a cat, and they freaked out. First, because they were very excited and never thought they'd have a pet in their home, but second, because my one son realized he just lost $5. Hospitality goes to extreme lengths to welcome, though I would suggest you don't snuggle with those you host. But Christian hospitality, real hospitality, calls us to open our homes, to open our hearts, open our calendars, open our wallets and our time and our energy, open our lives to welcome, care for, host, love, build bridges to our neighbors, our coworkers, our schoolmates and classmates, those we're on soccer fields with or in friend groups or social circles with. Christian hospitality calls us to host those we don't know, the stranger or the least of these, or those who we would rather not hang out with. And Christian hospitality even calls us to host our enemies. And today's story is about a man who goes to extreme lengths, counter-cultural lengths to show hospitality. It's a hospitality so radical that it transforms a man's life, and it foreshadows the sort of hospitality that Jesus will one day show. In loving his political enemies, King David hosted hope. He incarnated, he embodied hope. He hosted hope at his table. Now, if you've been around Columbia for a while, you know that hospitality has become a big deal for us. Last fall, we did a sermon series called Showing Up, and the whole series was doing a deep dive into what Christian biblical hospitality is. And we tried to keep the conversation alive throughout the year by at times when our culture's thinking about hospitality, to revisit the conversation. So last Thanksgiving we revisited the Super Bowl. People host parties, so we talked about it then. Memorial Day, it's a big kind of unofficial start to the summer. We talked about it then. And now, at the beginning of Advent, a season where it's all about God showing up and hosting us at his table, and our culture's thinking about tables and hosting and parties, we too this morning revisit this hospitality conversation. You'll remember, if you were with us, that our sort of theme verse, our watch verse for this series was Romans 12:13b, where Paul just says simply to the Christians in Rome, practice hospitality. Like you would practice an instrument, like you would practice a language, like you would practice a sport, practice hospitality. He doesn't say to those who are gifted with hospitality, practice hospitality. He doesn't say to those of you who like to cook or know how to cook, practice hospitality. He doesn't say to those of you who know how to decorate and know how to set a table and know which fork goes with which part of the meal, those of you practice hospitality. He says to all the Christians, all the followers of Jesus, practice hospitality. And when we looked at Scripture, we saw that in fact there is this thread of hospitality that weaves its way from the very beginning of creation in Genesis, where God hosted us in the garden. It makes its way through the Old Testament, and it's really comes to life as an embodied fully in how Jesus lives his life and in many and most of his teachings. And then the early church, when they were trying to decide, what does it mean to follow Jesus in our world? What does that look like? The most practical, real, down-to-earth way they found to practice following Jesus was to practice hospitality. And that hospitality that early church showed, I would argue, literally changed the world. Now, that's a conversation for a different day, but so much of the compassion and hospitals and hostels and orphanages comes out of this movement where these early Christians say, we will host anybody at our table, it doesn't matter. And it changed them. It changed how they viewed themselves. It changed their stereotypes, their biases that they held. Hospitality changed the world. Now, if you've not been with us as part of this series, or you've not heard it, and you're probably right now and you don't like hosting, you're freaking out, your blood pressure's rising because you're like, this sounds awful to me. Because you're thinking of hospitality like on the front of a Martha Stewart magazine, or curated in Instagram pictures and Pinterest boards. You're thinking of a hospitality that's about impressing people and showing off, and that's not Christian hospitality. In fact, we use these contrasts throughout the series to say, when our culture talks about hospitality, it talks about tasting luxury, giving people a taste of the finer things. But when we, followers of Jesus, talk about hospitality, we're talking about giving people a taste of heaven, a taste of something different, a taste of something authentic and real and transformative. Our culture talks about hospitality like putting on a show. We talk about it by putting on Christ. Hospitality in our culture is often a way of impressing people. You're such a great cook. You're such a fine host. You do this so well. But for followers of Jesus, it's about impressing love upon people. Our culture talks about hospitality in ways that we might say are sort of showing off. For us, it's about showing up. This is not that curated Martha Stewart hospitality. This is a kingdom kind of hospitality. And we said over and over, one of the reasons hospitality is so important and it demands our attention as followers of Jesus is because it has the ability to, one, change the world. It quite literally did change the world, and maybe your hospitality won't change the world in large, but it could change your neighborhood. It could change your apartment complex. It could change your friend group. It could change your classroom. It could change your soccer field. It could change your Boy Scout or Girl Scout troop. It could change the people within or in your sphere of influence. But more than that, and this is what I never heard people talk about hospitality, is hospitality has the ability to change us. It's the one practice, I think, that forces us to put the practices and teachings of Jesus into practice. In hospitality, where we are forced to come face to face with our selfishness. We are forced to step outside of ourselves into discomfort. We practice generosity. We put ourselves in places to love those who are unlovable or love those that we would rather not love. So with that review of hospitality in mind, let's jump into today's story. Today's story, we're looking at the life of King David, one particular story, in 2 Samuel 9. But if you're not familiar with King David, let me just give you some background to his life that you're going to need for this story to make sense. King David was the second of Israel's kings. The first was King Saul. King Saul was a good king. He started off well, but he consistently was disobedient and unfaithful to God. And so God anointed David, a humble shepherd boy, to be the next king. David didn't look like a king. You never would have thought he should have been a king, but that's who God chose to be the next king. David found himself in Saul's court. He led Saul's armies. David is the one who defeated Goliath for the Israelites and for Saul. David married Saul's daughter. He was best friends with Jonathan, Saul's son. David played the harp in Saul's court when Saul was distressed or overwhelmed to comfort him. And the people began to love David more than they loved Saul. And Saul grew jealous. And after a time, Saul attempted to murder David. He drove him out of the palace into the wilderness. David lived in caves and in the woods. He lost his wife. He lost his friendships. He lost his reputation. He lost years of his life because this king was trying to murder him, trying to kill him. Eventually, though, Saul and his son Jonathan, who would have been the heir to the throne, were killed in a battle, and David was made king. And we pick up the story a couple years later into David's reign. And this is what it says in 2 Samuel 9, verse 1. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now, there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He's at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-Debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-Debar, so from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. Now, let's just get this straight here, people. Let's make sure you're following this story. King David, who had lost years of his life, reputation tarnished, attempted to be murdered multiple times, had been out in the wilderness, lived in the woods, just like what we would he probably experienced what we would call PTSD. Years of his life gone and lost. He's now on top. He's the king. He won. He's in charge, and he's going to use his power to do what? To do what? To show kindness, right? To show kindness, not to show revenge, not to show self-protection, not even to enact justice, but to show kindness. I mean, this is crazy. This is countercultural. It's counterintuitive. You might even say this is counterproductive. This would be political suicide in David's day. In the ancient world, when a new king came to the throne from a different family, their first act as king would be to do what? To kill off anybody from the old family. to destroy their bloodline, to do away with every descendant, any bloodline, any claim to the throne. Now, you and I might judge and be like, that's a little harsh. He just lost the election or whatever. But this is not the case in their day. This was politically smart. This was wise because it's a way to secure your throne, not just for you, but for your children, to make sure there's not an uprising to take out your kids when you're gone. But whatever you do, you would never bring the former king's grandson into your palace and bless him. That's like asking for a coup, right? But this is where David gives us a glimpse of, we're going to talk about this throughout the sermon, a glimpse of the kingdom to come. David is, he's the greatest king in Israel's history. He represents the golden years. He represents the best of what Israel's kingdom was called and should have been. And Jesus, centuries later, is considered to have fulfilled what David started. He's considered to have, David is the foretaste or the preview of what Jesus will be. David could never fully live up to it. He was only a shadow, Scripture will say. But he gives us a taste of what the coming Messiah, God's kingdom, will be like. And David could never be it, but Jesus, He will finish what David was only able to start. And one of the clearest ways that you'll see David foreshadow or preview or give you a taste of a different kingdom that Jesus will usher in is in how David treats his enemies. I'm excited next year for us to read through the Bible chronologically together, because you'll see things you've never seen before. And this year, one of the things that I saw was how many times King David has the opportunity to take revenge or to enact justice on his enemies or those who curse him, and he stays his hand, he holds back. He refuses to treat his enemies like the world treats enemies. And that, in large part, is one of the ways that David foreshadows a different coming king, King Jesus. In David, we get a taste of what enemy love looks like, but in Jesus, it's fully revealed. And so the story continues when, Lord help me, this name's going to come up so many times I've practiced all week. When Mephibosheth, man, I had it an hour ago. Son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David. He bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth, at your service, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dog like me? I mean, imagine being Mephibosheth. I mean, you have been hiding and you know what your grandfather Saul did to David, and you're hoping he never knows you exist. And then one day you're summoned to the palace. You know what's going to happen. You're about to be eliminated. You don't need an explanation of what's about to happen. You're being brought in to be done away with. And when he walked in, he was clearly scared. How do we know he was scared? Well, the first things out of David's mouth was what? Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Clearly, he looked scared. And Mephibosheth, he had a ton of fear, but also there was more than just fear. There was shame, and we can experience the shame in this story if you look closely. First, he calls himself a dead dog. That's not exaggerated humility. That's internalized shame and worthlessness. That's self-hate. Second, the passage says on more than one occasion, it mentions his disability, and it says that he was lame in both feet. In today's society, we struggle to embrace people with disabilities, to treat them with dignity and full equality. If that's the case today, then it doesn't take much imagination to know how someone with a disability would have been treated in David's day. They were shunned, they were full of shame, they were looked at as worthless, and they were often considered cursed, and therefore they were excluded from religious life. He, no doubt, internalized that shame and worthlessness. But not only that, the text tells us that he's from a place called Lo-debar. And Lo-debar, when translated, could mean no word, no thing, or no pasture. In other words, he's from nowhere. He's from a wasteland. And you think, well, that's a big deal. Why is that a big deal? Because in David's day, your land was who you are. Where you are from, your inheritance, the land that you belong to, that was your dignity. That was your future. That determined who you were. And Mephibosheth has neither land nor dignity. To come from no pasture is to mean that he is a nobody. And how does David treat this shame-filled, fearful, overlooked nobody from nowhere? He says, don't be afraid. David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, the grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever the Lord, the king, commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, we're almost done, lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. And then it mentions one more time, he was lame in both feet. David's kindness expressed to Mephibosheth means restoration for him. It means the restoration of his land and his inheritance, yes, but more so of his dignity, a restoration of hope, a restoration of joy, of life. Now, if you're reading Scripture, if you're ever reading Scripture, a tool that you can use to try and understand what are the deeper things that the author's trying to communicate, one of the tools, the easiest tools to use, is to notice repetition. So in this story, the author mentions he was lame in both feet twice, and one of them like an awkward ending to the story. That's the author's way of telling us that this was a big deal, that something else is going on in this guy's life. It's not just that he has a disability, it's that has severely affected who he is. Repetition is a way of the author cluing you into something without saying outright he was full of shame. Well, there's another repetition that happens in this 13-verse story. In 4 of the verses, 1/3 of the story, there's a word or a phrase that's mentioned 4 times. Did anybody catch it? The word was table. You will always eat at my table, David said. And then he said, Mephibosheth will always eat at my table in verse 10. And then in verse 11, Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's son. And in verse 13, and Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. Table, 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 table. What is the delivery system of hope and transformation in this story? Say it. The table. What is the method used to enact transformation in this man's life? It's the table. It's a meal. It's being welcome in David's home. The author is saying this is where hope was found. This is the symbol of grace. This is the delivery system of transformation. This is the sign of a different kingdom. David, in offering hospitality, not the Martha Stewart kind, not the performative kind, though I'm sure what he served at his table is much better than what you and I will serve at ours. But David, in offering hospitality, the kingdom kind, transforms, as part of transforming this man's life. David's hospitality then becomes a sign of a new kingdom that is coming, a preview, a foretaste of a different way of living and ruling and acting in the world, a kingdom that's unlike any other kingdom. No other king would have done this. David does this, and he's only a taste of what the Messiah King will do, of who the Messiah King will be. He will host people at tables where enemies become friends, where dignity is restored, and hope is hosted. Hope is served on a table. This sets the stage for the greater King, King Jesus, who will build his ministry around tables, who will welcome sinners and outsiders, a king who will restore not just land, but who will restore lives. All of Scripture then waits for the fulfillment of this kingdom, a king who will embody all the good things that were seen there, will fulfill what David could never fulfill with his human limited abilities. And that king that comes is King Jesus. 1,000 years later, Luke will record in his gospel that Jesus comes in the line of David, that one of his great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers is King David. And then later in Luke chapter 18, Jesus is now on his way to Jerusalem. This will be known as the triumphal entry. If you're familiar with the story of Jesus, it's Palm Sunday. He's approaching Palm Sunday, where all of the Israelites were anticipating that Jesus would be the king, like David, who would overthrow the Roman Empire. He would fulfill what David started, and he would set his people free. Israel would become free from the Romans, and Jesus was about to do it. Palm Sunday is all about that journey, and Luke is bringing you to that journey. But we know that Jesus didn't overthrow the Romans, and he fulfilled the yearnings and the desires and what David started, but in a different way, right? And Luke records Jesus on the way to Jerusalem. And in Luke chapter 18, there's a story. We won't read the whole story, but there's a blind man. And the blind man calls out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And they try to shut him up and get him to be quiet. And he says it again, "Son of David, have mercy on me." This is the first time in Luke's gospel that Jesus is referred to as the Son of David. And Jesus heals him, but Luke wants you to see the Davidic connection in the story that follows. And so now in your head is King David, who ushered in a different kingdom, not the kingdom that's going to overthrow the Roman Empire, but a kingdom with different values. And then comes in Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus. And we looked at this story in detail about a year ago, so Jim did a fabulous job of going over it and digging into it, so we won't go into great detail. But I want you to see some of the parallels in this story. And so Jesus has entered Jericho and was passing through, and a man there by the name of Zacchaeus, he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. A flag should go up in your head right now. Chief tax collector and was wealthy. He was in bed with the Roman Empire. He was besties. He was working on their behalf. In other words, if Jesus is going to overthrow the Roman Empire, Zacchaeus is his political enemy. He is the epitome of everything that the people think that Jesus is about to destroy. Jesus should hate Zacchaeus if he's about to bring about David's kingdom. This man has gotten to bed with the Roman Empire, and he's worked on their behalf, and he's taken advantage of his friends, of his brothers and his sisters. He's the epitome of Jesus' political enemy. And then it says he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, I don't think that this by any stretch is being short is a disability, but Luke clearly wants you to see that there is a barrier in Zacchaeus' life to approaching Jesus. This isn't the lame feet of Mephibosheth, but it is a challenge. It is a barrier that keeps him from Jesus that he has to overcome in order to get to Jesus. And when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, "Come down immediately. I'm going to stay at your house today." So he came down, and at once he welcomed him gladly. Where is he about to go? Whose house? Zacchaeus. They're about to have a meal. They're about to throw a party. And so let me just say, at the risk of overstating my point, what is going to be the context or the delivery method for transformation in this story? A table, a party, a meal, hospitality. And so we see that happen. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner? But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times the amount. The tool used for the delivery of hope in this story, hospitality. The delivery system for grace and for transformation in this man's life, hospitality. For experiencing the power of the gospel, hospitality. This man met and experienced life change in the context of a meal, of a party with Jesus. So let me just step on a soapbox here. I know people love when pastors get on soapboxes. It's one of your favorite things. Too many Christians over-sacralize life. And they over-sacralize transformation and spiritual things. That is to say, they separate sacred things and secular things. And they say there's these secular things that are bad or not good, and then there's sacred things that are good. And in those sacred things, they say, this is the place where transformation happens. This is the place where God shows up. This is the place where God communicates. This is the place where God does stuff. And that's just not true. For the follower of Jesus, everything is sacred. There is no such thing as secular. There's nothing secular in your life. Because the Spirit of Christ is incarnated in you, everything you do is sacred. So if you do spreadsheets at work, that's a sacred act. If you grade papers, that's a sacred act. If you drive an Uber, that's a sacred act. If you do homework because you're a student, that's a sacred act. All of these things are sacred acts. There's nothing more holy about worship or a church service or something that's done in the temple. Everything becomes sacred for the followers of Jesus. And so in the life of this man, he has an encounter at a meal. His life is changed at a meal, at a party, because Jesus is there. And so that place becomes sacred. That place delivers transformation and hope and grace for him. And then Jesus concludes this story and he says, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And this was Jim's great revelation that he shared last year, is that he pointed to the fact that this verse, that last verse, Jesus came to seek and save the lost, is often used as the sort of theme verse or watch verse for evangelism in Christian circles. And it's in the context of hospitality that Jesus gives us that word, that verse, that saying. It is elevating the role of hospitality, the role of being in people's lives, of showing up around tables and parties and meals and coffee shops and pizza boxes or whatever it is. David gave Mephibosheth a seat at his table, and Jesus gives Zacchaeus a seat as his. David shows kindness to an enemy, and Jesus loved his enemies. David restored land, Jesus restored lives. David foreshadowed the kingdom, and Jesus fulfills it. And at those tables where they hosted people, they hosted hope. Hope was incarnated in the meal that they shared together, the party that they shared together, the time, the opening of their home that they shared together. You could teach about the hope of the gospel all day, I think. But until it's incarnated in the lives of Jesus followers, in the context of hospitality or communities, I find that it will probably be limited in its capacity to transform lives. I'm fairly certain of that. Until hope becomes more than something we talk about, but it has no ability to transform people's lives. But when hope is incarnated and it's shown in the way that we host people, in the way that we care for people, in the way that we welcome people, in the way that we love people, when that happens, I believe hope has the potential to transform lives. We don't need more sermons on hope. We don't need more devotionals on hope or more books or songs about hope. We need more tables where hope is hosted. We need more parties where joy is embodied. We need more dinners where peace is personified. We need more invitations where love is incarnated. Because wherever Jesus' followers show up, wherever they practice hospitality, that place becomes sacred. And those acts become sacred. Not because of the architecture, not because of the liturgy, but because the King is incarnated at the table. Let me say that this is why we do Little Christmas City. This is why we put on this event. This is our way of hosting hope for our community. David hosted hope, Jesus hosted hope, and we believe Jesus invites us to host hope for our city, for our community. We're not trying to compete with ICE or Nutcracker or whatever happened at Mosaic or the drive-through lights or all that stuff. That's great. We're setting a table where hope is hosted. We're throwing a party where joy is embodied in the lives of those throwing the party. A party that says, you are welcome here. A table that says, there is hope for you. A party that says, you belong before you believe. And when people walk through those doors for this event, they'll encounter lights and cookies and people dressed up as elves or shepherds or music. But more than that, they'll encounter people for whom hope has been embodied and incarnated in their lives. They'll encounter people who have been welcomed by Jesus and are now welcoming them in Jesus' name. They'll encounter hospitality, not the fancy, flawless kind, the kingdom kind. They'll encounter followers of Jesus who notice the lonely person, who get on eye level with a child, who speak kindness, who offer delight, who offer wonder, who make room in their space, in their home, at their tables. They'll meet people who incarnate and embody hope. At Little Christmas City, we get to open our doors and say to our neighbors, come on in. Come down from the tree. We've been waiting for you. There's a place at the King's table for you. And who knows, maybe someone in our city will feel like Mephibosheth, forgotten, ashamed, and from nowhere. Maybe that person will find a seat at the King's table this Advent Christmas season. Or maybe somebody will feel like Zacchaeus, hiding, stuck, but spiritually hungry, and will hear Jesus call their name at this party this season. In fact, that was the case last year. There was someone who was shunned and hurt by church, not our church, but another church, and Christians who had pushed them away. They had lost the hope and the joy that is the story of Jesus. But they found a spark of that hope embodied in the lives of people who welcomed and loved and hosted them last year. And that became a spark that led a slow journey back to a full experience of who Jesus is. It was a restoration of what God wanted to do. So to everyone who served last year, I know it was a year ago, but let me just say one more time, thank you. You threw an incredible party that welcomed so many people and embodied and incarnated the hope and the joy and the love that we talk about. And for those of you who have already been, the musicians, you guys have been rehearsing since July, you probably hate Christmas music right now. And those of you who've been up here decorating and setting up the art exhibit that's going to be the Sacred Space Art exhibit, people, thank you for the time you're already putting in. And for those of you who've signed up to help, man, we're so excited. Thank you for being willing to help. And to every one of you, I would say, if the Spirit of Christ lives in you, if hope and joy and peace and love are incarnated in you through the power of the Holy Spirit, then would you join us in helping throw a party for our community? One where things that seem to be secular actually become sacred because followers of Jesus are the ones serving, hosting this party. We want more of you to serve cookies, to high-five people, welcome them dressed as an elf or a shepherd, to simply show up and make room. This is our chance as a family to host hope this season, to show our city, our community, what the King's kindness looks like. And don't you think our world needs an embodiment of hope right now? Don't you think people are desperately searching for a joy? Can you feel it? Can you see it? Can you sense it? Why not offer it in a way where they're welcome to the King's table? This time of year, people are more open to the story of Jesus than they are any other time of year. But they often don't know where to start. Sunday morning can be overwhelming, though studies tell us that people, if their friends invite them to church, especially at Christmas time, they're more likely to come. But even still, Sunday morning can be overwhelming. But Little Christmas City, it's a party, and it can be the bridge that moves someone from far from Jesus to having a seat at his table. Advent is the season where God set a table for us. So let's set a table for others in Jesus' name.